Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV Whiskey 1, Good Vibrations, with a little story for you, a CW story in a way. When I got my ham radio license back in 1966 and as a novice, and eventually in 1972 got so that I could copy, or should I say read in my head, about 45 to 50 words a minute and copy 30 words a minute solid with pencil and paper. And I mean copy, even random characters. Back in those days, they didn't have any CW readers. They had tape recorders, and I mean tape recorders, with vacuum tubes and all. But they didn't have CW readers. So if you wanted to get the literal dope on a message, you had to copy it down. And if that message had a lot of random or cryptic characters in it, you had to be really good, because one mistake, you'd never know it, but fate would. In 1972, that was the last year of the draft during the Vietnam War. And I remember being in the locker room after swim practice, and the lottery had just been drawn. They had a lottery to see who would be most likely to get drafted. And a friend of mine cried out, "I'm not going, I'm not going." And I asked him, "What's your number?" 159, he said. And then I laughed at him and I told him, my number is 29. If there is any draft at all, if the lottery is run at all, I am going. And I made up my mind that if it looked like I was going to be drafted, I was going to enlist immediately. And I was going to use my radio skills, Morse code copying ability, as well as technical knowledge. By then I believe I had a general class license, but maybe it was advanced, eventually on the way to extra in 1973, I believe. But the fact of the matter is they didn't have a draft, and the catastrophe never occurred. They ended that draft then. I don't know how many of you were old enough to remember the Vietnam War, but it was a bad one. It was a bad one. It was as bad as or worse than some of the stuff that's going on in the Gulf right now. In particular, the climate was horrific. And a lot of people who got drafted ended up occupying a pair of boots in the mud, because it rained almost all the time over there. And I decided I wasn't going to go for that. If it looked like I was going to be drafted, I was going to enlist, and I was going to encourage them to make an officer of me on a ship or an aircraft, preferably a ship in the Navy, as a radio man. Now back then, they didn't have much in the way of machines to copy data. They had teletype, but a lot of radio men, they had to know the Morse code, and they had to be able to copy it, and they had to be good at it. And there weren't very many people like that who also had the technical knowledge to be able to repair the radio equipment on the ship if it happened to malfunction. But I had that knowledge and I had that ability. And I was going to use that to prevent my body from occupying a pair of boots in the mud and dying in the jungles of a country back then that was not exactly our friend, most of it. And eventually all of it, because the North, the communists, won. Back then we were just terrified that every move by the communists represented a possible takeover of the world. Richard Nixon was president. I don't know how many of you remember him either, but to the best of my knowledge, he was instrumental in ending the draft. But in any case, maybe I'm wrong, maybe my knowledge is wrong. But in any case, I do believe that my skills as a ham radio operator, and in particular my skills with CW, could have saved my life. Fortunately, I never had to go there and find out. But I would have enlisted, and I would have gone probably as a radio officer. And eventually I may have ended up in the military as a career. You often wonder what your life would have been like in vastly different situations if just one thing had happened. If just one thing had happened. But, again, that never had to take place. Nowadays, of course, you don't even have to know the code to be a radio ham. And they've got machines that will read the code, as long as they don't break. And you can still record it. But sometimes back in those days, you had to get the message right. You had to get it the first time, and you had to have it in seconds. So I was able to do those things because I knew the code. I still do, a little rustier, and I probably have a little more technical expertise now than I did then, but back in those days it was vacuum tube equipment. And I knew about vacuum tubes too. I knew how to fix equipment that ran off of those things. So ham radio can be a great skill to have, and you never know when it might actually save your life. Stan Gibilisco, W1GV, da-da-da, 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 saying 73 for now, and so long.